I'm very excited to be giving this talk in India. I have a lot of friends and colleagues where I come from in the San Francisco Bay Area who are building the cutting edge of generative AI and other AI systems. But in my opinion, we're creating a lot of raw, untamed power, and the way the future will be written is instead in how we use that. And India in particular, I think, has the curiosity and ambition and intelligence to figure out the best ways to implement that for humanity. So I'm going to talk about digital minds today, and you might have seen a lot of headlines. These were collected earlier this year in just a period of a few weeks with all sorts of interactions, whether it's mental health, education, the changing everything of general AI, Blake Lemoine, who left Google, talking about Sentience in Lambda, one of their AI systems, or my piece in The Hill, chatbots who love you, replica and companionship, generative AI and copyright. Maybe we need to shut all of this down. And of course, one of the godfathers of AI leaving Google to speak out against the risks. There's this feeling in the air that we're getting something radically new as a technology. And what I want to do today is give you a way to characterize that and think of it from the 10,000-meter view, not as much the day-to-day business operations, but how do we even conceptualize this thing we're all interacting with? And I'll argue we should think of it as a digital mind. So you've seen, of course, the amazing capabilities of these systems, such as GPT-4, which is now somewhat outdated. You have people like David Chalmers, one of the world's most famous philosophers today, talking about the possibility of these systems being conscious. This was a presentation at NeurIPS, the top machine learning conference, where he discussed this to computer scientists and gave a number of benchmarks as to how we think of a conscious or a sentient AI system. One intuition pump I like to share with people to think about what it might be like to be a digital mind is a slow motion video. This is about slowed down to 100 times speed, 100 fewer times speed. And this is a New York City subway. And you can see everyone's almost entirely motionless. You'll see a couple people, if you're paying attention, moving very slowly. But if a computer system learns to interact in the way that humans interact with each other, we'll feel much like this to it. It'll be a lumberjack in a forest of human trees. And how do we think about that? What is it like to be that sort of mind? That man's my favorite. You might have seen this paper that came out recently by some of my colleagues at Stanford. This is building small language model-based systems that have memory retrieval and can interact with each other, much like the non-player characters in video games, such as Animal Crossing or Stardew Valley. And they planned a Valentine's Day party together, coordinated and spoke to each other, made the relationships, and attended the party. And this is not something that any technology to date has been able to do, and I think that's because it has mental faculties, or it's starting to have mental faculties. These are being richly debated. There are many of them. I've talked a bit about feelings and experience and some of these softer notions. Also perception, having a model of the world, thought and agency, and of course, raw intelligence. And the way that social scientists like to think of these systems is in terms of two foci of experience and agency, where experience would be things like the ability to be acted upon, to be a moral patient, to have people care for you, and of course, sometimes to be conscious. Whereas agency is the ability to take action in the world, to be a moral agent, to threaten people, and to be autonomous, acting independently in self-governance in the world. And when we think of what it makes humans so special and many non-human animals, it often comes down to these two faculties. And increasingly, you're seeing people like Murray Shanahan and Emily Bender and Collar talking about these in computer science venues, whether these capacities are actually emerging in today's language models and other systems. I'll briefly, very briefly, and I'm going to go through a lot of slides in this talk, so don't feel the need to read everything, outline some of the projects that we've worked on that kind of run the gamut from experience of these systems to agency, where we look at things like predictors of social and moral consideration of these systems. Which ones do people actually want to interact with? We look at things like spillover, so the fact that if one AI acts in a certain way, we could judge the entire class of AIs very differently. Benchmarking, of course, people are struggling a lot with how we measure and think about these systems. You might know some of the literature on animal intelligence. So for example, there was a horse named Clever Hans who was thought to be able to do arithmetic, but it turns out he was seeing very subtle cues like foot tapping from the human who was interacting with him and didn't actually have that capacity. So how can we actually measure capacities in digital minds today? And of course, looking at things like autonomy and a topic I'll touch on briefly, which is the rise and fall of agency in these systems and how we've conceptualized that over time. So I'll start off with a project we started in 2021 before much of this hype emerged in generative AI on what Americans actually think about the possibility of sentient AI. So I'll show you some visualizations. This one's maybe one of the most striking. If we ask people pretty straightforwardly, do you think it could ever be possible for robots or AIs, we specify that for a bit of clarity and we define it, to be sentient, and we also define sentience as the capacity to have positive and negative experiences. Many people aren't familiar with that. We get about a third, maybe in each category, of yes, no, and not sure. But when we ask people whether they think any AI systems today are sentient, we actually see what to me was a surprising number, 20% saying yes, some AIs today are sentient. And then for ChatGPT in particular, we actually only asked this in 2023, the most recent survey. 10% said that ChatGPT was sentient. I personally don't think it quite has a high level of sentience yet, but it's an interesting topic, and people certainly are perceiving minds, whether they actually exist in these systems. We also predicted a number of values. So this is something social scientists like to do called pre-registration, where we specified intervals in which we expected these values to be. So this is agreement with statements in the top part. So this is about the moral valuation of AI systems. And it turns out that you can see the true values from the survey as blue dots. They're kind of on the upper end of these intervals. And that means that people actually were surprisingly morally concerned about the treatment of artificial sentience. So at the bottom there, for example, sentient robots and AIs deserve to be treated with respect. You can see about 75% of people agreed with that statement. We also looked at moral concern for different types of AIs. So we might interact very differently with something like a video game character as maybe the least morally concerning or the one we perceive less of a mind in, all the way up to human-like companion robots, who we really think of as being very similar to ourselves. I mean, on that scale, they're not getting very far, but they're farther than the rest. We also ask about predictions. So a very important question today is, what are people thinking is the future of AI systems? We in this room often know progress can be slow and haphazard, but the public expects progress to happen very quickly. So this is looking at 4 types of AIs. This is 2023 data, and asking people, in how many years do you expect these to emerge? For artificial general intelligence, you can see many people think it's already happened. They think we have something general in the AI world. You can see for superintelligence, human-level AI, and sentient AI, people actually, quite a few, think that it already exists today. I alluded to this result earlier. Some people think it will never happen, but it turns out the median of this data, which is usually how we like to measure this, a measure of central tendency like the mean, is around 2 to 5 years for each of these. That's very fast for these. If you survey experts on these, they predict quite a bit longer, but the public is thinking of these very soon, and I think they're very readily anthropomorphizing these systems, seeing them as having human-like traits, and we need to account for that in application. And we also ask about agreement with a number of policy statements. I won't go through these, but there are things like legal rights for AIs, but also government regulation to slow down AI development. That was definitely a strong finding in 2023. The US public thinks that we really need to slow down AI progress, thinks it's quite dangerous. And that's very different than the rhetoric you maybe hear in this room or hear from the leading generative AI companies right now. Okay, I'll briefly walk through a different study, which is looking at those 2 capacities I alluded to earlier. I talked about them as agency and experience. Those are kind of broad notions, but we wanted to run a study that operationalized them quite specifically. So we looked at autonomy as a manifestation of agency and sentience as a manifestation of experience, and saw how these affected user perceptions. So we can see here a number of different characteristics that we tested in a pilot study. And users helped us categorize these by whether they fit into the realm of autonomy, sentience, or other, and we didn't expect all of them to neatly fit in one of these 2 categories. But you can see autonomy is much about making your own choices and free will. Sentience is about having a variety of emotions and moods. And then there are other things like self-awareness or life, which is a related notion, but quite different in many ways. And actually, ratings for these were quite high. I won't walk you through all those numbers, but people did see strongly these capacities. Okay, so what do we find in this? How does presenting an AI system as autonomous or sentient affect people's views of it? And what does that mean today for the way people might be threatened or see sentience or have moral consideration for a system like ChatGPT? Well, we find that both of these increase everything. This isn't surprising. This is our baseline to show that we're effectively showing off these perceptions to people and they're affecting their views. We find that autonomy is associated with threat. So you might have heard of systems like AutoGPT. Can you raise your hand if you know about AutoGPT? Okay, so a fair number of people. I can't see you that well. When you present these systems as autonomous, as going out and taking their own actions in the world and making their own choices, they seem quite threatening to people. And sentience, the experience and emotions of these systems also affect that, but not nearly as much. Sentience has a bigger effect on all of the other variables we consider. So caution, that means sort of opposing the development of new AI systems. Perception of mind, seeing them as having mental faculties, as having a mind in the first place. And moral consideration. Do they think they're subjects of moral concern? Are they included in our social and moral circle? Sentience has the bigger effect on those. And finally, we see something really interesting, which is alluding to, I think, the conversation we're going to have in the upcoming years, which is that sentience descriptions kind of imply autonomy to people. And I think sentience is this general capacity that we see in systems as they advance. And I think we're going to have more people like Blake Lemoine perceiving sentience in these systems. We already do today, but there are going to be more news stories, more people thinking about, are these people rather than just technological tools? And that's something we're going to have to wrestle with in almost every context, but especially language modeling. There are a lot of reasons to consider these problems in the long run. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the alignment problem or AI safety. As we get these general intelligence systems, there are a lot of reasons to expect that we don't know how to control or work with minds in a way that's safe and robust for the benefit of humanity and other sentient life. So Superintelligence was a famous book written in 2014, and then more recently, my colleague and advisor at University of California, Berkeley, Stuart Russell, and then my colleague, Brian Christian, wrote The Alignment Problem, talking about these safety issues that you should think about at least a bit, if you haven't before, and consider whether, again, advancing the sort of raw power of these systems is what we need to do, rather than finessing them into a beneficial augmentation of human capacities and working them into society, which I think is the better strategy. Okay, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at University of Chicago and Sentience Institute and Stuart Russell at University of California, Berkeley, and my other colleagues at different institutions. And I'll just walk back a bit because I know I skipped over some stuff. I think these are the shorter versions of my slides rather than the longer version. So I'll take you through a couple of these other studies and talk about kind of where we're at today in this new field. We're looking at a number of different questions, and many of them are focused on user perception, but a lot of these are also philosophical. So as I mentioned, Dave Chalmers at NeurIPS gave a presentation on whether large language models might be conscious. There was a recent report by Patrick Butlin, Robert Long, and some other academics trying to walk through different theories of consciousness and see what they mean for AI systems. So you might have heard of, if you've looked into the philosophy literature, things like integrated information theory. So this is the idea that if we want to know whether an AI system is conscious, we think about how much it's integrating information across different domains. This is something very unique about the human experience of the world. I'm sure you've all heard of the idea of narrow AI versus general AI. Right now, we're starting to see some multimodal systems that are integrating vision and language and a few other domains. But really, there's a richness of human experience and the experience of sentient beings that we don't quite have in these systems yet. So there's a philosophical foundation that, for example, in the top left two squares, you can see. So we did a literature review on the philosophical and some empirical literature on the moral consideration and moral value of these systems. We also have talked about moral circle expansion. So there's a long arc of historical progress trying to understand how we interact with new people in our social circles. You can think of the very early days of humanity as the integration of other humans in local villages, and then in nation states, and now globalization, and then increasingly our interactions with non-human animals and with AIs as this expansion of humanity's moral circle. And the philosophical foundation here is important because people have talked about raising a fire alarm for artificial sentience. So the idea is that if we do create sentient and experiential systems, we want to know as soon as that happens so that we can react to it properly and that we can wrestle with it correctly as a society. And whether or not that actually happens, we still have these social questions, but once we have philosophers and experts saying that these systems are really digital minds, that they are really people, I think that's going to be a new discussion we're going to have about how to deal with this whole new class of entities. You might have heard of the idea of legal personhood for animals and increasingly for the environment. So in the United States, for example, Toledo, Ohio, a town has talked about one of the Great Lakes as having personhood as a way of protecting the environment. In Argentina, they've talked about personhood for orangutans, for primates, to protect them and their welfare and interests. And will we have that same conversation for artificial intelligence? Certainly people like Blake Lemoine at Google think that we should be having it already for these systems, but in the long run, that'll be a larger and larger conversation. So I'd now like you to focus on kind of the top right area. So these are looking at individual human perceptions of experience in these systems. So in the top middle, I don't think I have a laser pointer, I might. Oh, great. We have a paper in Computers and Human Behavior that is looking at different predictors of moral consideration. So what leads people to look at these systems and think of them as peers or as subjects of moral concern, the way we look at other humans, especially of our own in-groups, and then also some non-human animals. And it turns out that one of the strongest predictors is whether you're a fan of science fiction. So some people who are already familiar with AI and think about it as part of their life experience, they're already seeing these systems as deserving moral consideration. You see some other predictors. So one common finding in this sort of literature of social and moral expansion is positive emotions. So it turns out people who tend to feel happiness and joy and other positive emotions tend to care more about these systems as well. We've also looked at taking the perspective of these systems. So one thing we're sometimes good at as humans is taking the perspective of other humans. You might have heard of theory of mind, and there's a very rich nascent literature on that with artificial intelligence and computers in general, how we think of their mind and take their own perspective. What we're doing here is looking at the reasons why humans take the perspective of other humans and seeing if those still apply to how humans take the perspective of artificial intelligence, and we're looking at animals as well as a comparison group. So it turns out that people's perspective taking of AI is mediated by two things. One is empathy, the feeling of empathy, and the second is self-other overlap. So the way we measure this is we sort of show people two interlocking circles of varying distances, including a very clear overlap, and ask which one best represents your view of yourself and of this entity. And it turns out that the closer we feel to these entities, think of the way they're more embedded in our day-to-day life. Many of us are now using ChatGPT or other systems throughout the day. That leads to taking their perspectives and thinking of them as having minds. And finally, we have another project. I won't skip to the end, but I have a couple slides about it, looking at the different features of AI systems that lead to us seeing them as having experiences and deserving moral consideration. So that's a submitted paper to a conference called CHI, Human-Computer Interaction. And what we do is we present people with two different profiles of two different AI systems that vary in many features. So the reason we vary many different features is because these very complex systems we're now developing, we want to know which ones will evoke which user perceptions. So we look at things like, do they have a body? So we'll present one AI as having a human-like body, as having no physical body at all. Think of ChatGPT or Alexa or something. And other things like their ability to express emotion and perceive emotion, their ability to have language and use that, their autonomy, so on and so forth. And one of the reasons I really am interested in this project is that when will the next ChatGPT moment be? So many of my friends at OpenAI and elsewhere did not expect ChatGPT to take off so much. And I think that was because most of the field of AI is very technical. It's looking at the code, and people were very impressed with GPT-3, some people GPT-2 as well, and Instruct GPT. The technical advancement to ChatGPT was not so incredible. It was, for most people, sort of along the path of expectations. But there was a user interaction question where when you went from the older interfaces, think of an API like they still have for GPT, to this chatbot style fun interaction, that just took off and went viral. So if we think about what the next ChatGPT moment might be, I think one thing it might be is when we have a GPT-4 level capability in a language model that can react in real time, so it's much like having a conversation with a human being, has a avatar, so think of a virtual face. It doesn't have to be photorealistic. It could be sort of a cartoon, and that is personalized. So the one that gets to know you, has a particular name, knows what you like and don't like. And I think at that moment, we will see very, very radical change. And many, many people in AI think that that moment's coming very soon, or at least that we will have those 4 capacities. It'll just be a matter of some company deciding to put them together. And then we'll have a new class of person in our society that we're interacting with, which I think will have very unprecedented consequences. OK, great. And I mentioned the survey project and the autonomy and sentience project. We also have a research agenda where we're talking about these different projects we might pursue. I mentioned spillover. I mentioned the competence-based benchmarking of these systems. So that's focused on measuring. So Noam Chomsky is a very famous linguist who looked at the difference between competencies and performance. So in linguistics, when we look at human children or at animals, we often want to know whether they have a core competency of accomplishing something or merely show the performance of doing that in a certain task. And it turns out that right now, benchmarking is having a bit of an existential crisis because their focus is measuring the performance of these systems. So I showed you earlier the various benchmarks where GPT-4 is showing 99th percentile performance. Many people in the Bay Area right now are very skeptical of that as a sign of actual power of these systems because it's a very superficial measure. If you're trained on those questions or similar questions, for example, then you'll do very well without actually having the competency that humans have when they perform well on standardized tests. So think of what it takes to be a lawyer. In the US, we have the LSAT. When you are able to perform well in the LSAT, it indicates a deep understanding of logic and reasoning and kind of mental competency. But if you're a language model who's seen a lot of that information online or similar information, then you might not actually have that underlying capacity, despite scoring very, very well in the test. So I think this is something we really have to wrestle with, and I'll talk about this a bit more at the workshop tomorrow. But we need competence-based benchmarking. Again, we need to know whether they actually have that core competency rather than just the performance that we measure in various tasks. We have a project looking at autonomy in human-robot interaction. So that is focused on what it means for a system to be autonomous. I won't talk about all of the things we argue for in that paper, but I'll briefly say that most people think of autonomy as a one-dimensional scale. So the human's either very involved or not very involved. And in that case, it doesn't capture kind of the richness of what it means to be autonomous in the human context. So in the political theory and philosophy literature, there's a rich discussion of what it means to be an autonomous being. Think of being a citizen in a state and voting and acting of your own accord and all of that. So one thing we do is propose a two-dimensional taxonomy. So we talk about one axis being the extent of human involvement, which is a more traditional notion, and the other one being the extent of robot involvement, or the extent to which the robot is performing tasks of their own accord. So for example, you might have a human being very uninvolved with a system that is just wandering around. Think of a robot at a restaurant or on the street, wandering around looking for things to do, versus, say, a drone swarm. So drone swarms involve a lot of complex interaction and action-taking of the AI in addition to the human being. And that's a very different sort of autonomy, even though in both cases it's being shared between, or it's equal interaction between the humans and the AI, and that's not fully captured by the one-dimensional scale. So that allows us to capture that richness. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll just briefly mention what we find in this last project, which I had some slides on, is that around 2016, there's a huge change in the discourse in AI. So you might have seen some of this. That might have been when many of you heard about AI. It's when Microsoft, for example, started really using the term in their business. And that was a shift towards efficiency and existing business practices, making them more efficient using these AI systems. But in 2023, I think we've had a big change in that. The agency of AI seemed to fall in 2016, and now it's risen again in 2023. However, unlike the AI of before 2016, it's both high agency and high complementarity with human beings. And I think that's what makes this technology so unprecedented. It has a mind, and it is able to work with us, able to make us more productive and more efficient. And I hope as you go through this conference, you'll think about what that means for the nature of being a human being, what that means for the future of work, and what that means for the future of all sentient life. Thank you.
We have time for one question. If there's someone with a question, put your hand up in the air. Yes.
Audible. Yeah. Thank you, Jacy, for the presentation. Myself, Vivek, I work with Halliburton. I just had a quick question. So if we can use integrated information theory to measure the consciousness of my AI engine, then is it possible to draw a fine line or a trade-off between autonomy and sentience? Can you comment something on that?
The last thing you said was draw a line between autonomy and sentience?
Yeah, a trade-off, kind of a trade-off.
Yeah, so integrated information theory is interesting. It shows a lot of systems, just kind of current modern computers, as having a lot of consciousness. And it turns out anytime you try to measure AI consciousness or consciousness in general, very simple systems end up seeming to have a lot of it. And you can kind of always trick the system. And that's why I don't think it's going to be such a simple notion in the end. However, if we start measuring that in systems, I do think we'll get a finer grained picture of the different capacities. So for example, in the scientific discourse on life, the beginnings of biology, they originally thought it was this elan vital, this vital spirit that permeated all living things. And over time, what happened is they unpacked that into a number of different specific measures and operationalizations, such as homeostasis, reproduction, metabolism, et cetera. And I think better measurement and ideas around sentience, consciousness, and having a mind will allow us to do that. So yes, I think it will allow us to draw a line between something like autonomy and sentience. I'm not sure if it'll be a trade-off per se. You know, when we think of humans, we're very high in both of those capacities. However, if you think of spending sort of the finite compute of one system, you're not able to do everything at once. I don't think that systems today are so limited, but that is something we should consider, is whether they're specializing in sort of one aspect of mind rather than another. And that's something very different, because humans tend to have all capacities or none if we're asleep or if we've passed away. But these systems might be incredibly agentic, but have no experience, or have huge amounts of experience, but not be able to take action in the world. And we don't yet know how to think about that. Thank you.